Hello, welcome to this episode of The Real Deal. This is a fairly casual episode. I just kind of wanted to talk about how to get started on writing if you're interested in writing but have trouble coming up with an idea. I feel like it's fairly common that most people who decide to write a book or a story have an idea first, maybe, and then decide to write. I don't know, but I was talking to a friend and she said she'd kind of like to write, but she said, well, I'm not very good at coming up with ideas. So I thought, well, I feel like I come with a lot of ideas all the time. And so I started kind of looking at how do I come up with my ideas? And I thought, well, maybe I'll share how I get a seed of an idea so I can start writing about it. So I kind of broke it down into three major categories. So maybe these will work for you, maybe they won't. But if you really feel like you want to sit down and write something and are having trouble coming up with the concept, maybe this will help. So the first one that I thought of is character. So focus on a character that you would like to write your story about. And this could be a historical figure. So maybe you're like, I want to write an alternate history of Abraham Lincoln. And I just say that because, there's that movie, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, whatever it's called, Vampire Slayer. I forget. I have seen it. And, maybe it's just, or maybe you like to do a true fiction story. Maybe you're very, very interested in Albert Einstein and you think, I want to write a kind of a realistic, there's a word for this, fiction, historical fiction. I want to do a historical fiction on Albert Einstein. You can start researching and focusing on the person. It doesn't have to be a real person. Maybe there's someone in your life, maybe, a parent or a sibling that you think actually they're fairly interesting people. I'd like to take their personality. What would they do if they lived in a space colony 600 years in the future? Obviously, if you're going to base it on a real person, maybe talk to them about it first. But it could be a little source of inspiration if you know somebody that's kind of interesting. I tend to go pure fictional. I do have a lot of characters that I will very loosely base on other characters. So I have, for example, a couple examples from my books behind me here. So one of the major characters' name is Yunwei, and she's an Alceid, which is a type of a nymph. She designs animals for a living, and her thing was she was actually based originally on the concept of Marcella from Don Quixote. And in Don Quixote, Marcella is a very minor character. But what happens with her is she's very beautiful, wealthy. All the men are really interested in her, but she's not interested in them. And that's kind of where what Yunwei is like also. And so what happens in Don Quixote is that this young man who is very popular got snubbed by her, and he killed himself because she said no, and he left a note saying, oh, what a horrible, cold-hearted witch, drove me to suicide because she wouldn't go out with me, sort of a thing. And then at his funeral or his wake or whatever it was, his friends were all dissing her, talking about what a horrible person she was, and she shows up and she's like, look, all I said, it's not my fault. This guy, it's not my fault he went to these lengths. It's like, I'm allowed to not be interested in you. He's like, just because you come up and say you're in love with me and you don't even know me, doesn't mean I have to be in love with you back. So so there's kind of the spark that led to Yunwei, the character. I think they're quite different now, but that was kind of the seed that planted that character. Now, another one is there's a book I'm writing now that I haven't finished. I intend it to be a series of shorter books, like 40,000 word books. And he is based on a character in a game that I made him for a game that I played, maybe it was like 1 or 2 session game. And he's a little wizard guy that is a scribe, really, that works on making an encyclopedia. He's a little character made for a game. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Adventuring through a fantasy world, not to loot or find treasure, not fighting some evil enemy. He's really just going around the world and seeing everything because he's making an encyclopedia. So, so there's and then I built the story around that concept of the character. So could be the same with you. Maybe you've made a character in a game that you've played, if you play like D&D or some sort of RPG or something like that, make sure it's an original character that you've made. And maybe think, you know what, I think this would be a fun character to write a story about. Let's get get started. Just maybe put them in a scenario do some writing prompts, maybe some practice exercises, see what happens. All right, but maybe you don't really have a concept for a character, but maybe you have a great, what did I put here? What if? I put what if, but I mean, really it's a question. But I think a lot of the ones, the ideas I had came into what started from what ifs. So for example, in my book, I always point the wrong way because it's like opposite of what I'm actually doing here. Okay, but anyways, so Kyla and Elf Mastery. So Elf Mastery, the concept came before the characters, and the concept was essentially, what if nature, science and nature were actually controlled by mythical creatures? And that's not like a new idea. That's, a lot of mythologies built around the idea that gods and spirits and things are actually controlling all of nature. I think I just kind of took it, made it more like it was like a job, like people, it's your job to make those trees grow, go do it, sort of a thing. So it started with that concept. So you could take, if you're trying to think of a nice idea, just like what if, let's think of X-Men. So X-Men's based on the idea that there was this mutant gene in the human race that gave certain people superpowers. But what if that happened to ducks instead of humans? What kind of world would that create if you have like ducks with laser vision or psychic powers? Could be a fun, quirky stuff. I kind of want to write that now, but you can have it. What would happen if this happened to some sort of like non-intelligent animal, but they all of a sudden start getting these like super powerful abilities? That could be a fun little story. So yeah, just think, what if? Think of some quirky scenario. What would happen? What if the Earth got flung away from the sun somehow, and some scraps of humanity somehow managed to survive in the cold, drifting through the coldness of space with no sun? So come up with some ideas like that. I would brainstorm those because some of them might be too silly or too weird to write about. But a good launching point, might be a fun exercise to do if you're thinking of an idea. And the last one I thought of was, it's kind of a broad term, but setting or genre. So maybe you're interested, and this could include something like a period piece. So maybe you're interested in a particular part of history. Like I'm very fascinated with Roman history, for example. What if I decide to write about the life of a Roman centurion? And it's not, maybe I want to keep it fictional. I don't want to base it on historical events, but I'm like, okay, I can look into the structure of Roman society, what life was like for an average soldier, and base a story on that. Or maybe you're into genre fiction. So maybe like, well, I'm really into fantasy. And so you might go into the world building first, right? So maybe it's like, okay, I don't have an idea for a character or anything like that yet, but I have this cool idea for a world that I like to build. Or it could be maybe you're really into steampunk, and so maybe you're a cosplayer, but you haven't really got, like, okay, I'd really like to write something along the steampunk, a dystopian steampunk story. So you just create the world first and then start adding characters from there. So lots of ways to go about coming up with ideas. I think if you're committed enough, it's not hard to do. But I would just warn, no matter what approach you take, for me personally, I really like stories where the characters are the forefront. And I've been complimented in this, in my regard, in terms of Elf Mastery, and that I created the world first. Like, that's where the concept came from. But I did receive a compliment in that, like, a lot of people would be tempted to, you have this world with all these cool things going on, but instead of focusing on all the cool world and all the things going on and forgetting about your plot and your characters, make sure that remains a backdrop to your, it's not, I don't think necessarily, I mean, there's probably a way to do it, but I would say 99% of the time you need the cool world should be just a backdrop to what the characters are doing. Otherwise, you're going to kind of overburden your readers with exposition, which some great stories do this. Lord of the Rings goes into some huge detail, but I'm going to be honest, if you've read the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings doesn't even go into that much detail for what Tolkien had written in regards to Middle Earth. But I think even a lot of modern readers going into Lord of the Rings, reading it, it's a little more world exposition than a lot of people want to read. Even me, and I love it. And even I still kind of skip a lot of the the dense descriptions of things. Some people love it, but I would say for a lot of the time, though, I would say try to keep it in the backdrop. More people, I feel like, will be looking for compelling characters. So I'm just basically, the idea is no matter what your launching point is, I think you need to make sure your characters are front and center, even if they're the last thing you develop in your story. So a pretty short little chat today, but if you're looking for some ideas, hit me up. They're constantly spilling out of my brain. Some of them are terrible, but you're welcome to them. All right, well, have a good day.